Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. This is the AAR to our 10th Lyceum debate on anarcho-capitalism or anarcho-crapitalism. And the defender of anarcho-capitalism is our black and gold Pepe Swithun, and the critic was Ruminations. So since Swithun went first in the debate, we'll give Ruminations first crack. So the question I would ask you is, one, where do you think you were strongest and then weakest? And then two, where do you think Swithun was strongest and weakest?
Well, I think that on my end, I was probably strongest in terms of the empirical case for the nation state being a relatively strong correlate with individualism and freedom of speech, which are ideas that don't really seem to have a conceptual defense in, say, ancient city-states or in other kinds of, or empires or other kinds of arrangements. That being said, I do think that one of the reasons it may have seemed strong is because this probably isn't an objection that a lot of libertarians hear. Given time to process these ideas, I'm sure that there would be anarcho-capitalist counter-arguments that would emerge, but I think that that objection was rather fresh. I think that from Swithun's angle, the greatest strength was in detaching himself from the Cancellian separation of natural rights from the consideration of freedom of speech as a separate issue. That is, Swithun did concede that there was indeed a kind of inherent value in this idea of individual self-expression and so forth. But then went on to raise the question of to what extent atomization as it exists in the nation state actually does produce a pursuit of truth. And I think that a lot of people might be convinced by that line of thinking, well, yes, we want pursuit of truth, but does kind of mass consumer cultural individualism really amount to that? And I think that that's a decent objection to raise. Just in this opening these opening remarks, what another thing I'd say is that where I think we were probably evenly matched was in the whole question of the judge's dilemma that I brought up, like the idea of, is the non-aggression principle as the basis of anarcho-capitalism, is it something that has to be understood in terms of this comprehensive Rothbardian system where you have to follow the non-aggression principle, or can it be a kind of pragmatic arrangement where you basically follow the Rothbardian model, but you may make exceptions here and there? And I think that, to be honest, our disagreement on that may come down to an actual disagreement on first principles, whereas I would see that saying that you don't have to enforce the mechanism as kind of self-defeating, whereas for Swithun, the whole the free society project might be worth entertaining some inconsistencies with respect to certain dilemmas, because he has a certain flexibility with respect to the NAP. But those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, Swithun, the same set of questions for you.
I think, where would I say I was the strongest? I think I pushed hard on sort of what the nature of the state was to some extent, because I think we came up with a disagreement with that. And we didn't, I don't really think we got an exact consensus on what we were exactly meaning when we were using aggression and what the state was. I think I generally laid out the case for anarcho-capitalism generally quite well, although we didn't really get into most of what I raised in my opening statements, because it was mostly around the freedom of speech question, which I will concede was my worst aspect, because I simply did not expect it. I was not prepared for such an objection. I have been thinking about it subsequently. But that certainly wasn't on my sort of reading beforehand to get sort of sharpened up for the debate. R's point best was probably his empirical case for the freedom of speech. Mainly because my history is reasonable, my history isn't great, so I'm not immediately going to be able to respond hugely well for that without any preparation. He articulated it well with the historical notion of sort of like the formalization of freedom of speech and rights from sort of like the post-Enlightenment nation states. I think one of R's weaknesses would have been, as it was outlined, he was kind of prepared to argue against what he considered the main sort of Rothbardian approach to anarcho-capitalism. Whereas, whilst I wouldn't say I would advocate the form of David Friedman, I do think there's a little bit more flexibility, I think, as he noted in the beginning, in that. So I think he kind of deviated away from what I was saying to some extent from what sort of an orthodox Rothbardian would say. That'd be my general appraisal.
Okay. What I would say is, I think as these debates can somewhat be trial and error, the scope was a little too broad. But I will say that you and Swithun and Ruminations, you both quickly kind of zeroed in on the fundamental issue. So even if the fundamental issue wasn't explicit at the beginning, it was nice to see two interlocutors that didn't get bogged down in side issues and both sort of homed in on the main issue. So the only thing I would say is maybe we should be more explicit as to the component we're going to debate. But that was less of a problem than in other debates. And I think, yeah, being, quote, blindsided by Ruminations' novel critique was probably giving him the advantage. Because as Edmund says in the Prince Caspian, even the best swordsman can be disarmed by an attack he doesn't know is coming. So I think overall, though, it was nice to see that you both were able to keep to the topic and, not get sidetracked or get muddied with, ad hominems, which we here at the Lyceum try to avoid and try to build this cadre that can do that. Anarcho, you're kind of an old hand with the Lyceum, so why don't we ask your opinion on the topic of the debate, how the performance were, and what your thoughts were in general?
Yeah, so I agree with you that the topic's a bit broad. I think you had a good idea that for a future debate, if you could get some sort of ANCAP or right libertarian figure to debate a socialist on whether either capitalism was inherently unstable or that socialism was the inevitable consequence of history. But for the broader debate of is ANCAPistan a feasible working system, I think sorry, hold on one sec. I think Swithun made some good points on how ANCAPistan would not be the current system. I think that's a good point to get across, though maybe there should be more details on, I guess, how the state allows for the centralization of large corporate power through, as you mentioned, centralized banking and licensing monopolies and so forth. I think Swithun also made a good point about how getting rid of the state can make things worse. So that's not necessarily an argument against ANCAPistan, though I think that could be strengthened by also giving examples where getting rid of the state, even like by accident, say in Somalia, could make things slightly better. It's actually interesting how Somalia is kind of used as a stock answer as to why you shouldn't get rid of the state. Yet there's actually a study called Better Off Stateless that goes into how Somalia actually slightly improved, especially relative to its neighbors in the time it was stateless. So that's maybe a point Swithun could have brought up. And I think it's interesting that Swithun concedes that ANCAPistan might resemble, in the conclusion, he said it might resemble something of a medieval system like medieval Iceland. It's kind of funny, so that's a little bit of a meme, though I would have maybe we could have heard more details on how medieval Iceland actually worked. That could have been, an interesting reference point for how society today could have looked. And then on the Anarcho-Crapitalism side, I think Ruminations made good points with how retaliatory tariffs, and I would say even beyond retaliatory tariffs, politically charged tariffs that try to get a state to stop intervening in their markets, to like say with China, for example, fixing its, pegging its currency. If you have a tariff that will end on condition that they end certain policies like that, I mean, that could be seen as kind of a broader macroeconomic form of self-defense, where the state is using force, but it's trying to use force to end other force. You could argue that there is a certain NAP argument for that. And I think also the state serving as the role of the commons, that all individuals can access the state. And like in a somewhat democratic state, there is room for like even like say Singapore, which is listed as a flawed democracy by the Democracy Index, has like a place called Speaker's Corner where everyone can at least technically go to protest, their grievances against the government. So I think those are some of the stronger points, and I think I'll pass it on to Tim.
Yeah, okay, Tim.
I thought Swithun did a fairly good job in defending anarcho-capitalism against the novel critique of it. I think David Friedman is probably a better anarcho-capitalist than, as well as Walter Block, than Rothbard. I'm not anti-Rothbard, but not exactly the biggest supporter or pro. I'm not an anti-Rothbard in that regard. Because on some level, I think the NAP is sort of absurd. But then again, I think most, and as David Friedman has said, we still read Aristotle, and that's sort of a thinly veiled insult. I think most moral philosophies, it's not that they are true or false, but things like Kant's categorical imperative, I would say, are also, and a lot of socialists will use that to justify redistribution. And Rawls, I don't think Rawls is a very good moral philosopher. So if you're going to say Rand or Rothbard's a bad moral philosopher, I would say Kant and Rawls are equally bad. So I think the NAP is sort of insane. I think the weakest area that Right Ruminations had, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a critic of it or a compliment, is definitions, and what exactly is the state. I tend to take like a sort of Wittgensteinian view of definitions, which just basically means that definitions are democratic insofar as that definitions are, to the extent that definitions have any value, unless most people agree that's what the thing is, it's sort of useless. If you have this sort of private language that you privately think, if you privately think this means ping pong paddle means something else that no one else believes that, for example, then to a certain extent it's insane. So, and Right Ruminations did admit that he was using two definitions of the state, but and at times I think when Todd critiques anarcho-capitalism, I have similar problems. Like, is the late Roman Empire an example of private defense, or is that a public army raised by with a private actor in charge of it? So now I'm not saying this to be a death by definitions, but I do see definition problems of what exactly is the state. And to a certain extent, I'm glad you zeroed in on a topic, but until I think that can get resolved, I think this debate can tend to go into death by definition.
So maybe, Tim, we need a debate on definitions.
Wouldn't be opposed to it. I mean, I'm not sure. Like, by current I come from a somewhat political science background, so like the word democracy, by all standards, any state before, United States in 1860, like current standards, is not a democracy. That's one of the objections to like democratic peace theory, which is off topic here, but that's just a side example of definition problems. And I do think that the word state needs to before you define what is an anarchist capitalism, state needs to be sort of defined, because anarchy is absence of a state. So,
all right. I guess now it's a little more free form now, but I think one interesting question to ask would be, if we were to debate some aspect of anarcho-capitalism again, how would we want, what lessons could we learn from this debate in framing the next one? So I'll give this to you, Ruminations.
Well, I think, as was raised, especially when probably due to kind of consensus that there are different things that people mean when they use the term the state, and that I was indeed using two terms, that I agree that my biggest flaw was probably not in giving more precise consideration to those definitions beforehand. So I think that in the future, any debate on whether the state should exist, including if it's with respect to anarcho-capitalism, should probably begin with defining one's terms, namely, what is the state, and therefore, by consequence, what is the absence of the state. Now, I agree with Tim on that, but I disagree with Tim on the democratic nature of how terms are defined. And the reason is because I think that very often people may be using terms in a certain way that brushes against something that is a more obvious, proximate concept to what they're saying. So, for example, people use terms left and right, and they can use them with a certain degree of vagueness, but that in the soup of that vagueness, there is maybe like a better definition that kind of presents itself in terms of the obvious phenomena that are proximate to the discussion. I think that all that's really important is that the terms be defined for the outset of that particular conversation.
Okay, I'll ask the same question to you, Swithun.
I actually think trying to base it on a future debate on the definition of the state is probably not the best way of going, actually, just because the state is not the most easy thing to define precisely. It's kind of, well, taking the anarchist position, it's kind of like it's got sort of legitimacy of some description, but it's also like a mafia at the same time, and exactly how those interplay in a precise definition is not straightforward. I worked on a piece trying to really sort of define it as precise as I could, and I wasn't happy with it, and I haven't come up with any ideas to return to it. I think probably easier to do is just to outline what anarcho-capitalism actually entails in a more positive rather than a negative sense, and go from there, which is what I attempted to do at the beginning of the last one. So I think so. The absence of taxation is a certain property of it, and free entry to legal and defense services, I think, is probably the three. I mean, you could go into more detailed things on property theory if you wanted to, but I think those are the three major points: lack of taxation, free entry to legal services, and defense. And I think that's an easier way of going about it than, because the state can get very, very difficult to define.
Okay, I think you had something you wanted to add to that, right, Ruminations?
Well, I did. I think that this might be what you're picking up on may be simply the fact that when people use the term the state, they may, without even knowing it, have more than one definition at hand. So maybe I would meet you halfway and say that, well, we should have this discussion or debate on defining the state, but we might have to come to multiple definitions, or more than one definition, just because we may be talking about different things. But I think that if you can't define, I think that anything that you can discuss, insofar as it can be discussed, has to be subjected to the strictest definition possible. So My thinking is if you can't come to a single definition of the phenomenon in question, then the problem is probably that you're trying to define more than one thing. So you may simply need to multiply the number of categories that you're dealing with. Another reason that I think this is important is that it might be too much of a boon to the pro-anarcho-capitalist position if the definitional issue is not brought up, precisely because some people may define, for example, the state as any kind of institutionalized use of proactive violence. So, for example, there could very well be a state simply by virtue of not observing the non-aggression principle, even if it's in a rather sporadic way. And in that sense, certain things that might be posturing as anarchy or anarcho-capitalism might in fact have elements of the state within them, insofar as they are not non-aggressive.
Okay, Tim, you have some to add?
As far as terms being I didn't say they would be purely democratic, but I did say that they're somewhat democratic. Like, take the word libertarian. If you ask anyone before 1960 what libertarian would mean, it would mean a sort of anarcho-syndicalist, and it's quite clear. Now, in this sense, there is a lot of similarities between anarcho-syndicalism and anarcho-capitalism. So then maybe the soup thing you're talking about is actually true. I mean, Kropotkin, Keith Preston just had a post on this. Kropotkin got accused of being because he's a sympathizer of Israel.
I think you mean Bookchin.
Say that again?
I said I think you mean Bookchin.
Bookchin, yeah, Bookchin. Sorry. So I do think terms evolve, so to speak, over time period. So do you think the state is the same thing now as it was, say, in 1600 England? I mean, the state is very large. You read a book like Discovery of France. France didn't have a centralized government until, they had, lots of different languages. Same way with Germany. Same way with England. There's numerous smaller local kingdoms that would get combined later in the process. So I do see that the state has changed. I mean, the modern nation state is, even the United States, the state between 1850 was relatively small. In 1870, got a lot bigger. By 1930 or 40, it's huge. So I do think the state has changed to a much larger entity.
Okay, Anarcho, what are some of your thoughts on this?
I think the definition of state is an interesting one. The common answer people give is the Weber, because I think it's so precise and it carries all the aspects people typically think of when they think of the state. Legitimate monopoly of violence over monopoly over the legitimate use of force in a given territory. I guess the most arbitrary or the most vague word there would be the one legitimate. And as someone brought up, the mob can technically have a sense of legitimacy in a territory, in that people recognize that it has power and control there, and can pay their dues to the mafia in return for safety and security. Does that make the mafia morally legitimate, or any ruling gang? Does that make it legitimate in a moral sense, or is it more of just people go along with it for their protection? Therefore, it is by definition legitimate. So I think that's where the definite. I tried to avoid. I don't know if debates about definitions of things are the best way to go. I think that it's a bit. I think semantic debates are, in my opinion, kind of the least interesting debates to have. I prefer to have debates on either moral axioms, moral praxis, or real world application of certain ideas. I think So you're trying to stick with that rather than, what is the best definition of this state is probably the best strategy going forward with.
Yeah, Ruminations, you had something to add?
Yeah, I do agree with what was just said, in that, to my thinking, you would not want to have a debate as such about definitions, because definitions are symbolic descriptions or approximations. What's important is that the definitional status of things be defined for a given debate, so to make sure that the conversation is as clear as possible and people know that they're talking about the same thing. And in that sense, you might say that the definitions are defined by the context of the conversation. So with respect to the question that Tim had asked me, is do I think the state in the 13th century or whatever is the same as the nation state or what have you? Well, once again, I think that depends on which definition of the state that you're using, and the usefulness of the various definitions is rather decided by the context of the conversation. And a given conversation may necessitate more than one definition, but what I would say is that a lot of libertarians will use the term the state to imply almost that which is institutionally in contradiction of the non-aggression principle, so institutionalized proactive aggression. Now, in this sense, the modern nation state is the same thing as a medieval state. But if you're talking about it on a less status-oriented, more phenomenological level of, say, the state as rising with modernity or something, then clearly those two states are distinct things. And I'd also note that I don't like Weber's definition, because it doesn't have to be. That's one of the things by having a monopoly on the use of force is not necessary for the institutionalized proactive use of force, which I think, regardless of whether it was a monopoly, most libertarians would at least rhetorically refer to as the state.
Yeah, the maybe another aspect, I wasn't necessarily, it was kind of under the hood for me. How much interaction prior to the debate did you have with Swithun, Ruminations, to sort of hammer out the parameters?
I sent him an email giving him three or four paragraphs about my position. To an extent, we did deviate from that, but it was meant to be a very basic introduction. And then he sent me something similar, just saying, to what extent he was a Rothbardian, to what extent he was more his own thing. And so there was at least a kind of mutual, I guess, apprehension of the atmosphere of the context.
Yeah, because one of the things in previous debates in the Lyceum, there hasn't necessarily been a lot of communication between the interlocutors beforehand, which can lead to some unnecessary confusion. Now, of course, even having discussion up front doesn't always eliminate the confusion, but I tend to think that more of that's better. That might even mean declaring the debate a week in advance to give people time to talk to each other beforehand. I don't remember how much time I gave you guys before we started. Do you remember? I think it was like 3 or 4 days right after a roundtable discussion, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess I'll ask Tim. Tim, what do you think about that particular strategy of reducing confusion between the participants?
It can go either way. I mean, it could just increase the confusion to render a debate to a certain extent impossible. I do, in general, think hammering out terms ahead of time is to a certain extent important, but a lot of times the debate is actually over the term in itself. What exactly does that mean? Exactly does the term mean? Which is why I asked. And some people get bothered by debates over semantics, but I see them as necessary if you can have debates over substantive issues. I actually think, to a certain extent, the semantics at times are the substantive issue. But as to As to strategies to reduce that, I'm not sure of how useful that is.
Okay. Do you have anything to add to that, Anarcho?
Not particularly. No.
Okay. Maybe the next question to ask would be, what kind of debates would you guys like to either see or participate in going into the future? So I'll start with Swithun.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I suppose just on the, I suppose you could have a more detailed one on aspects of anarcho-capitalism about, as I pointed out, sort of whether free entry to sort of like legal services without sort of prohibitions on certain people becoming arbitrators effectively, and prohibitions on certain organizations providing security services more explicitly on that would narrow the focus of the discussion somewhat, which could be interesting. And those are some of the sort of classic sort of critiques of anarcho capitalism. Beyond that, not debate. Well, I'm interested in woke capitalism, but I've never really got to the bottom of it. Whether it would work for a debate is another question. But as to what forces are at play there, and is it deliberate on behalf of the elite business class to atomize society even further and destroy the family to make more money, or is it just the fact that it's popular? I don't know. Whether it worked for a debate, I don't know, but it's something I thought about and don't really have an answer to. So a debate could be interesting.
Okay, right. Ruminations.
Well, I think that insofar as you could make debates over definitions, that's an idea that I'm still contemplating. I hadn't really considered it, but I think an interesting place to start would be a debate on the nature of left and right. And I think that even beyond debates, that the whole conversation of defining left and right, and I suppose if you wanted to take it beyond definitions, is the left or the right desirable? And what different left and rights are there throughout history? But I think that for debate purposes, the definition of left and right, in both a relative and a cosmological sense, as well as the desirability of the left and right in both those senses, is something that, generally speaking, would, I think, make for interesting debate material.
Okay. Anarcho Rain, still your thought on the question.
So there's a lot of ways you could go into the question of what debates could be held. I mentioned one was the possible debate between a capitalist and a socialist on whether or not the means, or I guess whether or not it was inevitable historical fact that the means of production would become communally owned. I think is an interesting way topic you could take the capitalist socialist debate. I wouldn't mind getting like some kind of sock dem to debate, say, the Western European model or the Nordic model. I use model in quotes because those countries are actually a lot more different than a lot of sock dems care to say in terms of how they implement their various forms of state cap, or their forms of welfare capitalism. Yeah, I think it's also a fair. It could be a fair debate to discuss the moral. Do market processes or state actions follow from? I guess the NFP has already been debated, but yeah, is how about are cooperatives like a sustainable business model? If not, are they inherently unstable due to market forces, or is it due to state intervention that makes a cooperative enterprise? Or is state intervention necessary to maintain the cooperative model itself? I think are all interesting debates you can go with the capitalist with the capitalist themed debates, I would say.
All right, Tim, your thoughts.
As far as debates are concerned, I would be interested in see arguments against a one world Leviathan. Back when David Friedman was on this channel, I believe David Friedman pressed Todd on the cost diminishing returns. Because one of the reasons why I'm very sympathetic to anarcho-capitalism is I don't really, many of the arguments people make for statism, I'll use that term with air quotes, I don't really see why, therefore, you wouldn't want a one world Leviathan. A lot of the pragmatic or practical objections that people raise against a one world government no longer exist for technical and cultural reasons. I mean, I've traveled some amount, I've lived a little bit in Taiwan as well. The world to a certain extent is a lot flatter in the sense you can get to Japan or Tokyo or wherever within a 16-hour flight for less than $1,000 almost anywhere in the world if you live near a major airport. So the sort of practical objections to running a one world empire or one world Leviathan no longer exist. And enough people know English that you could have laws all in English and at least some people would know them, or English and Spanish or something like that. So one of the reasons I remain sympathetic to anarcho-capitalism is I don't really see any reason why anyone wouldn't. If you have these judges' dilemmas, it seems like the only solution to judges' dilemmas is to have one mega law that everyone on Earth would have to follow. I'd be interested in that.
All right. Anarcho, do you have any questions for Swithun or Ruminations, maybe points of clarification or whatnot about the debate?
Well, let's see. We got 25 minutes. I don't want to nothing too much. I just I guess I would ask Swithin if he could elaborate a little more on the medieval Iceland model, because I think he might have done so in the debate, but it might have gotten cut off because his internet was a little choppy. I guess I would also ask Ruminations if he thinks that is anarcho-capitalism not sustainable because of how human nature is today, and if so, how would human nature need to change in order to accommodate for it?
Yeah, so go ahead, Swithin.
I remember bits about Iceland. I don't remember the exact model. As I said, my history is not as good as my theory. There was you chose to be part of a certain sort of group which would kind of defend you, and basically, if you weren't a part of any of these, no one would deal with you. And so there was sort of like mutual legal sort of defense agencies. There was also the aspect as well, if you couldn't prosecute your own case, you could basically sell it to somebody else who could. So that would be a way of getting around the pool. But I don't remember the precise details of the rest of it, so I can't comment at the moment because I don't remember it well enough, unfortunately. But David Friedman's paper is a famous one on that. But my point really with the historical examples, the point that there have been significantly different systems than that we have had historically than we have today. And my point merely was to point that things have been done differently in the past and have been relatively stable. So any radical alteration doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to collapse into chaos.
Yeah,
that wasn't the answer you wanted, but
Ruminations. You can go ahead and respond to the question directed to you.
Well, I think that the aspect of human nature that makes anarcho-capitalism unfeasible, given a certain set of values that one wishes to see enacted, is that human nature is strongly collectivistic, conformist, and ideological, and I'm not really counting on that going away anytime soon. And I think it's something that is either explained through um, either theological explanations or through evolutionary explanations. But if it is more, it does fit with a certain biological explanation of human development. And insofar as that's the case, what I'd say is that humans were developed for circumstances which no longer make those particular collectivist behaviors strictly necessary. And I believe that those tendencies, although maybe necessary for a certain primitive kind of survival, are no longer, would seem to be intolerable if viewed through the lens of modern intellectual man. And so in a state of statelessness, or you might say in a state of organic, spontaneous order, I believe that the Hoppians would be correct in predicting a reemergence of those more severely collectivist social arrangements. And so for that, in that sense, I believe that the nation state is a kind of very tenuous, but also very valuable provision for those very delicate circumstances in which that those particular tendencies can be, if not suspended, then at least mitigated. So I guess that would need to change, but that will not change. And so I don't entirely accept the premise of the question.
Okay, Tim, do you have any questions for Ruminations or Swithun about clarification or the debate in general?
Well, I guess I'll start with a few questions for Ruminations. Why exactly did you decide to debate this topic on anarcho-capitalism? To a certain extent, I'm somewhat suspicious of many critics of anarcho-capitalism. I think your argument against it about Socrates and freedom of speech and so forth was very good, very good. But in general, I'm not a capital A anarcho-capitalist myself. I'm not an NAP or anything like that. I don't do anything associated with anarcho-capitalism. But to a certain extent, I think it's true as far as theories of ideal government can be true. Again, but I don't do anything else other than occasionally talk about it. But I don't know exactly what an anarcho-capitalist society would look like. So maybe that'd be absurd. But I also don't know exactly what an anarcho-syndicalist society would look like. I mean, there's plenty of people that say that Barcelona was just a, not really that much of an anarcho-syndicalist country to begin with, just a sort of Catholic country with trade unions. So why exactly did you debate anarcho-capitalists? I mean, is it do you not like Rothbard? Is it do you not like David Friedman? You think they're incorrect? What was the reason behind the debate?
Well, the reason is that I thought that I would make a comparatively less suspicious critic of anarcho-capitalism compared with a lot of the types of criticisms I imagine you have in mind. That is, as someone who is actually, I'm rather fond of Rothbard, at least in large part. But in other words, it's because I found prior critiques generally of anarcho-capitalism to be not only weak, and not only insufficient, but also in performing their critique of anarcho-capitalism, they have imported various aspects of socialism, opposition to Austrian economics, opposition to capitalism, and so forth, that are unnecessary. So, in other words, because I'm a person who's sympathetic to the Austrian school of economics, because I am sympathetic to classical liberalism, because I am sympathetic to any number of the concerns, and because, like, unlike some people, like you'll hear, for example, like I'd say the Soho Forum or Debating Tom Woods or something like that, I also know the topic and have spent a lot of time listening to these people and reading them and so forth. And that I just thought that the proper arguments against anarcho-capitalism are not routinely made, and I wanted to make such a case that I thought would be more to the point of what I thought it should be, and would not then import certain theocratic or socialistic elements, which I would not wish to import because I do have certain minarchist tendencies.
All right, Tim, do you have any questions for Swithun?
I'm not sure entirely of what your knowledge of Hans Hoppe is. I've seen a little, but what exactly is Hans Hoppe's view on the NAP? And what is and his definition of statism? I mean, as far as living libertarians, I'd say he's, one of the biggest ones. What exactly is his view on the definition of the state and let's escaping my mind here. The other thing, yeah.
Hoppe's definition is essentially the ultimate decision maker in a defined territory. So there is sort of a group or an individual who has legally the final say. That is it. That's primarily it. And because of this, they can then, in most cases, require a unilateral fee for their legal services. So you then get the classic sort of territorial monopolist on the provision of legal services and the power to tax. That's Hoppe's essential position when it comes to the definition of the state. Is that clear? Just so we can focus on this, and I'll talk about the NAP.
Yeah, that's clear. And then the AP, of course.
Yep. So Hoppe's NAP, again, I would say Hoppe doesn't really talk about the NAP as much, and I think associating it with Rothbard in a certain sense is unfair, because really it's just an outgrowth of property theory. It doesn't stand alone. It's more of a case of anything which is against the rules of legitimate property acquisition is therefore by definition violation of non-aggression principle, basically just because it violates the property acquisition theory. So Hoppe's view is that is essentially the Lockean Rothbardian position when it comes to the initial ownership of external property, although he would start it by saying that we own ourselves via his argumentational ethics, if you have come across that, which essentially says in the presupposition of debates and a discussion, it's necessarily a peaceful occupation, which requires a recognition at least of the legitimate ownership of your opponent's vocal cords. And if you didn't have this, you couldn't argue or debate anything. And then if you outwork that properly, you end up with libertarian anarchism. And that's essentially...
How much of that do you, in your debate with Right Ruminations, would it subscribe to it? I'm very familiar with Hans Hoppe's argumentation ethics. I think he did have a lecture at the PFS about NAP. I could be wrong about that. How much of the debate with Swithun did you, because I don't know your views entirely as well at all, really. So, but I do Hoppe's not inside and out, but I know him fairly well, or well enough to understand and
Mhm.
tell them to somebody else. How much of that did you bring in the debate with Right Ruminations?
Well, I mean, broadly speaking, I wouldn't buy argumentational ethics. I think it's interesting, but I think it misunderstands the nature of ethics, as most sort of post-Kantian stuff does. But the main aspect was, I suppose, my opposition to taxation, which is broadly around sort of Rothbardian property acquisition theories. Although I would allow for various caveats, and I would treat it as a general principle as opposed to an absolute rule. And then following that, of course, legally free entry into security and defense services, and also for legal services as well. So I would say that's sort of an outgrowth of sort of the property acquisition theory, and basically not interfering with somebody else's personal property without having been previously aggressed, or at least having a large level of just cause, which is, well, even if you did have just cause, well, my position would really be, although I suppose you could say, well, as an aside, David Friedman makes an interesting argument. He says that certain anarcho-capitalist societies could actually ban drugs if the people who didn't want them would pay more than those who wanted them, and made it so that they could be illegal effectively in the jurisdiction. So the way I was conceiving of anarcho-capitalism, I think the framework I outlined is consistent with various different forms of legal norms that could be enforced. It's just that those norms would be enforced on a competitive basis as opposed to a single monopolist. So I'm a bit laxer than sort of Hopper and Rothbard, if that's clear in any way. Tim.
Okay, I think we'll begin the final statement since we're nearing the end of the hour. We'll start with you, Right Ruminations.
Well, the thought that's been going through my head is that if I were an observer of this debate, what would be the two things that I would want to see fleshed out more, or to learn more about Right Ruminations and Swithun and Dobson with respect to their positions. And my conclusive position on that is that from myself, if I were listening to myself, I'd like to hear, well, how does he define the state more? What are the parameters of the thing he is saying should not be absent? And would have wished to see more preparation on that end. And from Swithun, what exactly is his position? Ray, the competing formulations of property theory, and if you're too loose with property theory in terms of making exceptions, like with the judge's dilemma, or in terms of being pragmatic about the NEP and so forth, to what extent are you an anarcho-capitalist, if insofar as your understanding of the NAP is flexible in that sense, in which case the desire would be once again in the direction of further refinement of definition in that direction as well. So that's my final thoughts.
Okay, Swithun, your final thoughts.
I suppose going forward, we could, I suppose, although this would be a bit more of a parochial discussion, we could jettison the term anarcho-capitalism and call it Swithunistan and go from there, because then any sort of prior conceptions of what the appropriate understanding of the term anarcho-capitalism actually is would not arise. With respect to the NAP, I mean, no one really dismisses David Friedman. Says that David Friedman isn't an anarcho-capitalist. But as I pointed out, he's perfectly happy with the situation where if someone pays enough to ban drugs, then that's fine. I mean, that they pay more. That's the efficient system. That's going to work in his sort of amoral anarcho-capitalist society. So I think the NAP to a large extent is a bit of a distraction when you're coming to anarcho-capitalism. Anarcho-capitalism, in my view, is primarily a way of enforcing a particular norms, although not all of them. There'll be some that you have to be consistent through all of them, as opposed to a general universal legal theory, which it would be if you had a particularly Rothbardian one. So, as I say, it may be worth just dropping, in certain circumstances, an overall description and just starting from scratch with, okay, what do you think is the case, and going from there, and then bringing notions that we think we've heard elsewhere and importing them here may be avoided, and discussion may be clearer.
Okay, Anarcho Rain, what are your final statements?
I think anarcho-capitalism has good certain uses as a teleos. There are aspects of an anarcho-capitalist society, namely free trade, sovereignty of property rights, and like free association, definitely, that I think. And I would actually say that the Hoppian ideal of self-selecting communities is something that we could work towards, and I think Keith Preston's sort of pan-anarchy kind of represents what kind of like my ideal vision of the world without the state would look like. So I guess when I think of what going forward, what kind of reforms I want to make, it kind of runs along those lines, even though I do think states will become more centralized as things go on. And I think I actually would argue that one world state, from what we've seen of historical trends, is kind of inevitable, and I think there are certain practical things like, say, nuclear proliferation, and even like some could argue climate change is an issue that's going to push towards the existence of a one world state. But even then, I think it should be run along that kind of ANCAP thing where you give people as much ability to self-determination and to select what kind of communities they want to be in. Even if states are never abolished, which they probably won't be, it's good to give people the freedom to decide, like, what kind of services, kind of like a market of states in a way. But that's sort of, so even though I don't think anarcho-capitalism will come in my life, or even though I don't think Ancapistan will ever be a reality, I think we can definitely push towards some of the ideals in the immediate term.
Okay, lastly, we'll give it to you, Tim.
I do think the NAP is, to a large extent, central to anarcho-capitalism. Whether that's a good thing or whether that's a feature or a bug is of some question. One of the things I always think when I see these homesteading, someone like Sam Sear debated Walter Block on the, and people make fun of the libertarian homesteading theory, but a question I've always had is, why exactly should the workers own the means of production? And actually, Proudhon and Marx sort of got into a small dispute over this back in the 1800s. When Proudhon pointed out that property is theft, Marx supposedly said that this was false. So the Marxists themselves have a property acquisition theory, and a theory of when it's okay to be aggressive and not aggressive. Socialists do too, syndicalists do too. So it's not just libertarians that have this sort of issue regarding, what exactly is aggression, who owns what, who gets to use of it. I generally think that someone like Carl Schmitt, gets things correct for someone like Stirner, that, people who control it, people who use it, control it. So I do think that in terms of philosophy, defining, proper use is very central, which is why my interest in anarcho-capitalism. And this sort of relates back to Smith, who sort of has this mix, this Rothbard called proto-Marxist, and who Rothbard called proto-Marxist anyway. You mix your labor with your capital, contrary to the subjective. So I do think it's important. The NAP is important. So that's my closing debate. But I thought Swithun did a very good job at critiquing, at being sort of a surprise attack, so to speak, in the debate. But yes.
All right. Well, thanks again, Swithun, Dobson, and Ruminations for participating in the debate. Thank you, Narco Rain and Tim, for joining us tonight. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.